Hi, today we're going to work on the exciting task of memorizing polyatomic ions, and to help you with that I'm going to give you some naming tricks and then help you see some naming patterns. So what I came up with, and there's lots of great songs and other things out on the web, but I just came up with 3 simple words and numbers to get me started on the main polyatomic ions, and from there I can build with some naming patterns. So my words are 1 clone, 2 co-creates, 3 Bo Peeps. Alright, what in the world does that mean? Well, the numbers are going to tell me the charge on the ion. And then the words have some element symbols in them. Cl for chlorine, N for nitrogen, C for carbon, capital Cr there for chromium, capital S for sulfur, B for boron, and P for phosphorus. So we can find in the naming clue there the element we're going to use, and for each of those we're always going to have 3 or more oxygens. So let's check out what those end up looking like. With a -1 charge, I have chlorine and nitrogen, and that gives me, down here, chlorate and nitrate, both with that -1 charge. Next up, the -2 charges, and I saw a carbon in there, so that's going to be carbon plus those 3 oxygens with a -2 charge. Next up is chromium, and notice that it's got a capital C, so that means we're going to bump up our oxygen count to 4, CrO4, 2-, and then last of all a bumped up S, so that's SO4, 2-. And then last of all I've got my polyatomic ions with a -3 charge. The first one is borate, BO, start with 3 as usual, 3 negative, and then capital P, so I'm going to take phosphorus and add an extra oxygen, PO4, 3-. And my names of those are borate and phosphate. So that's my baseline, and from there, if I can memorize those, I can start to use some naming patterns. So our first naming pattern has to do with gaining or losing oxygens and how that would change your name. So we're going to pull out chlorate here, ClO3, negative. I have to have that memorized. Once I know chlorate, though, I actually can fairly easily add on 3 other names to that. So if I lose an oxygen, then my formula changes to ClO2-, and my name changes from chlorate to chlorite. And that's going to be true that anytime I take one of those 8 ions and lose an oxygen, the suffix changes to ite. And what if I lose 2 oxygens? Well, then my charge is going to stay the same, but it's ClO-, and to say that I've lost 2, I'm hypo, like hypoglycemic, low on sugar, hypochlorite. So I've got ite and hypo, and that's a double loss of oxygen. Now what if I gain an oxygen? Then my charge again stays the same, and it's ClO4 negative, and that means I've got a lot going on, like a lot of energy. That's hyperchlorate. So 1 more than the 8, I've got the 8 plus the hyper, and that means I gained an oxygen. So start with your baseline, chlorate, gain an O, you gain hyper-8, lose 1 O, you have ite as an ending, lose 2 O's, you have hypo-8. So let's use that on another one on our next slide. If I pull out nitrate, NO3-, and I remove one of those oxygens, then I have NO2-, and that loss of oxygen means it's nitrite. And borate, well, borate's going to be nice and easy for us. For this class, we're not going to learn any other types of borate. So we've got 3 of these down so far. So for sulfate, we're going to start with SO4, 2-, that's sulfate. And if we lose an oxygen, we get a new ion, SO3, 2-, which is sul, hopefully you know this now, phyte, because I lost that oxygen. There's another related ion here, though, and that's HSO4-. So something happened here. I had sulfate, but I added this H onto it here, and so when I add that H on, I gain an H+, and the charge becomes more positive. So notice I went from 2 negative to now just 1 negative, and the name changes slightly. Now instead of just sulfate, I can see I have a hydrogen, so it's called hydrogen sulfate. And that takes care of a family of ions that go with sulfate. I can see that same pattern play out for a couple of my other ions here, carbonate and phosphate, down at the bottom here. If I have carbonate and then I add a hydrogen, it becomes HCO3 and the charge gets moved one notch up towards positive, and the names are carbonate and then hydrogen carbonate, or another older name that it's known by is bicarbonate. Similarly, for phosphate, I start with PO4 3 minus, and I can add H's onto that. When I add those H's, adding 1 takes my charge up 1 notch, adding 2 takes my charge up 2 notches, and then I just need to specify that it is phosphate, or hydrogen phosphate, or dihydrogen phosphate, because it's got the 2 H's on it. Finally, we'll look on the next slide at chromate and one other family of ions, and the rest are just kind of oddballs that you'll want to come up with some way to memorize. So here we've got chromate, and then its friend is dichromate, where I have 2 of the chromiums, 7 oxygens, same exact charge. The last family of ions that we're going to look at come from a monoatomic ion, actually, which is oxide. If I add an oxygen, if you recall, then we added the per prefix, and so we have this ion where I have another oxygen, same charge, and this is called peroxide. And then finally, if I add a hydrogen onto that, I have OH, then we would think of that being hydrogen oxide, or it gets abbreviated hydroxide. So it says that we added that hydrogen, and then notice the charge also became 1 notch more positive. So that's our final little group of ions that are easy to learn together. And from there, good luck. Thanks for watching.